Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justine Paradiso, Marketing and Programs Manager for the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of myself, the Chamber team, and our Board of Directors, I'm so pleased to welcome you to our April monthly membership event. Reminder, they have the chat feature. If you have any questions today for our presenters, please feel free to put that in there and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. I'd like to begin by thanking our ultimate presenting sponsors who make this event possible. They are Medical Associates Clinic and Health Plans, Midwest One Bank, Q Casino, and TH Media. A virtual round of applause for them from wherever you are. Today's presenter is Jeffrey Hartz. He is the Managing Director for the Air Service Development for Mead & Hunt. Jeff has more than 17 years of airline planning and air service development experience. He brings hands-on experience in all facets of airline planning, including marketing, analysis, forecasting, financial planning, and analysis, schedule, pricing, and revenue management. Jeffrey's airline background includes working in strategic planning, scheduling, and marketing and management roles at American Airlines, American Eagle Airlines, Big Sky Airlines, and the Mesa Air Group. Jeffrey has a bachelor's and 2 master's degree from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and is a certified commercial pilot and flight instructor. We are also happy to have with us today our Dubuque Airport Director, Todd Dalsing, who will also be available for any questions you have at the end of this event. And with that, I turn the mic over to you, Jeff.
I appreciate it, Justine, and I appreciate everybody coming out, virtually. Hopefully this is the last virtual one that I get to do, and next time I'm in person, right, Todd?
Absolutely. Have you back.
So we're going to start off talking about the industry trends, kind of what's going on in the airline industry. I know we did this back last November, and needless to say, things continue changing in the industry, and really want to kind of give an update of where things are going, where we're seeing, and then we're going to delve into kind of specifically what's going on in Dubuque and kind of what both from an air service perspective today and also what we're doing, trying to get additional service into the Dubuque Regional Airport. So last year was truly a year like no other. I came into the industry literally right after 9/11. So I experienced 9/11. I experienced the Great Recession. I kind of hoped I'd never have to deal with that type of thing again. And lo and behold, you can see here in this slide, it just got a lot worse. And so we've had really, 4 recessions over the last, 40 years. And each time in the industry, we get a little bit of a pullback in the amount of capacity, number of seats. And so in the 1980 and the 1990, it was about 5% pullback in seats. The dot-com bubble and then 9/11 resulted in, about a 10-15% reduction in capacity. And then the Great Recession was really the big one. I mean, that was the one that really kind of restructured the airlines. Those that hadn't gone into bankruptcy through the mid-2000s went into the bankruptcy at that point. And at that point really had been on a unprecedented growth, unprecedented profitability period of time. And then 2020 hit last March. And so needless to say, you could see there at this point in 2020, about 65% of the capacity vanished almost overnight. So this is coming back. It's coming back slowly in 2021, but it is going to take many, many years to get the overall national and international marketplace back to where we were. So when you look at it by month here, and again, we all remember a little over a year ago, went from, oh, this could be a problem to, holy cow, this is just terrible. The airlines essentially went from, relatively normalcy to 95% of the passengers vanished within a week. And so, April last year, capacity was out about 70%. May was about 75%. And then after that point, things started trailing back up. Especially, we saw a unique change in the industry, really favoring leisure, really favoring, wide open spaces or beaches. While business travel has essentially ceased to exist, especially the discretionary business travel, the leisure travel is what's really been changing and shifted last summer and really, really going into this spring is where we've seen that change there. April was about 25% down from 2021 versus 2019. And we're looking forward into, May and June timeframe is really looking at that 15 to 20% down versus 2019. So while things are still getting, substantially better from where we were last year, we're still going to be really far down from 2019 levels. And a part of that is relatively permanent. Again, when we talk about, the permanent nature of the airlines, we're talking a couple of years, just because of the fact that a lot of airlines, we'll talk about in specifics, retired airplanes permanently from their fleets, and they're planning on replacing them, but those deliveries really don't start happening until 2023 and 2024 timeframe. So you look at by region for the U.S. industry. Domestically, we're down in 2020. Second half was down about 44%. The Caribbean was down roughly the same amount. So again, if you're in wide open spaces, you're in the beach destinations, you're in the Caribbean, the airlines kind of kept some of that capacity there, but really saw a decline in the Latin America, the transatlantic, the trans-Pacific. Canada is essentially non-existent. You've really seen the international non-Caribbean really hammered through this period of time. When you look at the seat capacity changes from last year versus 2019 for the different airlines, it really was a tale of two worlds. Essentially, if you're a leisure airline not named Hawaiian, it really wasn't nearly as bad as what it was for the legacy carriers. United, JetBlue, although they're not technically a legacy carrier, they are very much a coastal airline. Their hubs are, Fort Lauderdale, Boston, JFK, LA, and needless to say, those areas got absolutely trounced in the pandemic from an air travel standpoint, and they got hammered as hard as anybody else. Delta, American, Alaska, again, when you look at the traditional airlines, they were down substantially in 2020 versus 2019. When you look at the leisure carriers, Spirit, Sun Country, Frontier, Southwest, Allegiant, they were down a lot less than the others. And Allegiant, again, was only down 6%. And once we look at going forward, we'll talk about this a little more in a bit, those leisure carriers are almost flat, in some cases actually up as we go into 2021, as we've seen this shift in the capacity. Hawaiian, that's a unique one. That's just because the Hawaiian Islands really were shut down up and through until November of last year, and really haven't seen a big jump until about February of this year. And so that number has been climbing for them as well. So when you look at the load factors, again, back when, pre-COVID times when we'd fly, it was a miserable experience. You had 85, 90% of the seats full on average, and that really meant, popular routes, popular days of the week, Sundays, Mondays, Fridays, virtually every single flight on every single seat on every single flight was full. Needless to say, COVID really changed a lot of that. System load factor for 2020 was about 59% nationwide. Again, dropping up from about 85, 86% to 59% was a significant drop. But that's really kind of, especially when we talk about passenger numbers, it's really kind of masking the fact that we're actually down not 25 points, we're down 70% in passengers in a lot of cases because of the fact that the capacity was down so much. And again, you can see there that the year-over-year load factor changes. It really changed by airline type. So again, the more traditional business airlines, the airlines that were stronger on the coast, got hit harder than the leisure airlines. Spirit, Frontier were a lot less impacted by this. American was actually one of the outliers for the quote-unquote traditional airlines, down only 21%, third highest load factor overall, and that was in large part because of where their hubs are. Their hubs are, Phoenix, Dallas, Charlotte, Miami. Those four hubs really weren't down a whole heck of a lot for American, whereas Philadelphia, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. were down a significant amount for it. So they were able to buoy essentially the rest of the system by Dallas and Charlotte and Phoenix through the pandemic. So while passenger numbers really kind of essentially dropped off the face of the earth during the pandemic, the thing that's also just as worrisome for the airlines has been the fare changes. And so while, passenger traffic is down, 50, 60, 70% in 2020, the average fares dropped 36% on average across the industry. The ultra low-cost carriers, Frontier, Spirit, Allegiant, were down the most as they were trying to essentially stimulate and buy the traffic by lowering the fares in order to get that leisure passenger onto their airplane. When you look at Alaska and Delta, especially Delta, who kind of took one of the more conservative standpoints as far as reducing the capacity as much as anybody else, as well as blocking middle seats. Their fares weren't down nearly as much, only 24%. So again, really kind of a tale of two worlds with the different airlines. So as we've talked about before, going back several years as I've done these, frankly, from 2011 to 2019, there was never a better time in the airline industry. Profitability was soaring. The airlines, infamously said, "Hey, we'll never lose money again." Frankly, probably what the one thing you ever want to say in the airline industry, which is as cyclical as any industry out there, is you won't lose money again, because we all knew something was coming. The problem is we never expected exactly what COVID happened. I don't think anybody, even in their worst nightmares, expected to have this type of impact to the industry. So again, when you look at it, about $115 billion of profits were produced in that 10-year period of time. Last year, the revenues dropped about $100 billion, losses about $40 billion. And frankly, that was only $35–40 billion, in large part because of the federal government really stepping up last year to provide that payroll support packages to the tunes of literally tens of billions of dollars to the industry to support them. That losses would have been substantially higher without that. So you look at the pre-tax margins by airline. Again, when you look at it, it's a tale of two worlds. The more traditional airlines, the airlines that are more exposed to the coasts, really got hammered in this process. Hawaiian, again, the fact that virtually nothing was flying for much of 2020 was down, it had a negative 87% margin. JetBlue, again, as I mentioned, really heavily coastal tied as far as where their bases are, 74%. American, again, while we talked about they had a huge amount of passengers, a higher load factor than everybody else, it didn't translate into profitability. A lot of that happened to be flying, unprofitable flights, having fares that were much lower than they had been in the past, led to a much lower profit margin than some of the brethren, like Delta, who was able to reduce a lot more flying, get a lot of permanent costs out of the airline by retiring fleets, by voluntary separations by employees. A lot of costs will be able to remove from that. And then you get the couple of the ultra low cost carriers in there with Spirit and Allegiant performing the best on it. So when we look at kind of the fleet trends by size, and this is essentially COVID accelerated the trends that we were seeing before. The 50-seat airplane was on its way out eventually. Some consultants have been infamously saying for the last decade the 50-seater is going to be gone in the next couple of years. It's still going to be around probably until 2030, but it's going to be in increasingly smaller numbers over the next decade. And the COVID really kind of helped accelerate that. So 45% of the number of departures back in 2005 were 50 seats or smaller. It was 20% in 2020, and we're going to see 2021 and beyond shrink even more as Delta has really said, hey, we're taking this opportunity to essentially get rid of these airplanes. American is shrunk some of those this year, especially. They got rid of the rest of their 44-seaters, and even United's starting to remove some of them as well. But what's happening is you're getting more and more of the bigger airplanes as well. Again, more and more airlines are taking deliveries of those 150-seat plus size. Not necessarily the larger wide bodies. Not many of the 777s, 787s, A350s, the 300-seat airplanes. It's more of the 150 to 200-seat narrow body airplanes that are really being delivered here over the next handful of years. Lots of fleet restructuring has happened during this period of time, and we'll talk a little bit more detail on some of these airlines, especially American and United, because again, American's our sole carrier in the market, and United is kind of our key target that we're trying to grow with. But kind of high level, as I mentioned, Delta and American have really cut permanently fleets. Delta eliminated 6 different fleet types. American eliminated, I think it was 7 different fleet types through this period of time. And that's because you had some sub-fleets in amongst theirs. But Delta removed 220 airplanes permanently. American removed 150 aircraft permanently. Some of those will be replaced eventually by new deliveries. So the 757s for American will be replaced by new Airbus A321s. Very similar airplane, slightly more seats in that, but those aren't coming online for another couple of years. Those big wide bodies, the 767s and A330s, similarly, are going to get replaced by 787s. American still has, almost 50 of them on order, except they're not going to really come in until, 2023, 2024 timeframe for the majority of them. So a lot of these are going to end up just taking time to get some of this capacity back in the market. United hasn't made any permanent fleet changes. They've done, semi-permanent parking of aircraft in the desert, but they haven't said flat out, hey, we're getting rid of all 757s, we're getting rid of all 767s. They've just taken more of a wait-and-see approach to see how this actually responds and how it evolves over the next couple of years. So the networks overall, so when you look at it globally, One World, Star Alliance, and SkyTeam, over 10% of the fleets of all of those airlines that make up those alliances were parked in the desert. So if you're in Roswell, New Mexico, or Victorville, California, things have never been better. They quite literally have 500, 600, 700 airplanes sitting on their fields. But if you're, in the airline industry or you're the airlines, literally hundreds, if not thousands of airplanes were permanently parked as part of this. So you look at the, O&D passengers by business model. One of the things that's really changed with this is the network carriers shrunk so much during 2020 is you had a growth from the ultra low cost carriers. Those are the Frontiers, the Spirits, the Allegiance of the world. And those guys really grew, or actually, let me rephrase that. They didn't shrink as much. In a couple of cases, they grew through this pandemic. But we're really going to see this too over the next couple of years as those low-cost carriers continue growing. And it's going to take longer for these network carriers to get back to their levels before. So we look at it from a global airline impact standpoint on, where things are at versus 2019. You can see here by, the spaghetti chart here, the yellow one is China. Obviously, they took the biggest hit immediately because of the January impact of COVID there. But because of their, essentially shutting down the country completely for 2 months, they were able to get it a little bit more under control than a lot of the rest of the world was. And they're such a big country with a big domestic market, they were able to get their domestic operations virtually back to normal by October of last year. When you look at the rest of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, they also fared much, much better through the COVID pandemic last year. And they were, roughly in the 30 to 40% down year over year. The rest of the world, essentially was at best case 40, 45%. And when you look at especially, Canada, Oceania with Australia and New Zealand, those markets were really down, 70, 80, 90% through that time period as countries had varying levels of requirements and shutdowns. In the U.S., again, you can kind of see that in that light blue. We tracked on the higher end of this, in large part just because our industry was so much bigger than a lot of the rest of the world, and the unwillingness to essentially shut down or park fleets that a lot of, especially Europe, did through that period of time. So when we talk about it, it hasn't been, all gloomy. We'll start getting into some more positives here, hopefully here coming forward in these next few slides. Again, another spaghetti chart. We've got 3 different time periods on here. The light blue is 2019. That's, what we're looking at as our base level for air service that we're comparing to. The dark blue was the awfully pessimistic, essentially jump off a cliff after COVID hit in mid-March, when we dropped down about 95% fewer passengers by April than we had the previous year. Bottomed out at, 50 to 60,000 passengers a day instead of the 2.5 million that we had been at. It started coming back in July, especially with the wide open spaces. Wyoming's, Montana's, Colorado's really had a resurgence. Same thing with Florida. But then we essentially just, flatlined. We essentially plateaued at that point for months. We had a few spikes around the holidays, around Labor Day, around Thanksgiving, around Christmas. But for all intents and purposes, we've really been kind of flat from July through December. We started seeing, especially now with vaccinations kind of kicking off in January, you started seeing certain parts of the country really start picking up in passenger traffic. And so while we've, more than doubled the number of passengers where we were in, December and January to where we are now in April, we're still, almost 1 million passengers shy of where we were in the past. So we still have a long ways to go, but we certainly are much better positioned than where we were a handful of months ago. As I mentioned, it's really been a tale of two or three worlds in the United States with passenger traffic. And here you can look at the, sort of graphically for the state, for the country on this. And really, this is looking at March 2021 versus 2019 on where the passenger traffic is versus 2019. The deeper the red, the worse off it is. And so you really see, again, as I mentioned, the coastal areas, the essentially northeast from Pennsylvania up through Maine, and then the West Coast, especially Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, really have seen a massive decline through that period of time. As I mentioned, if you're Montana, if you're Wyoming, if you're South Dakota, if you're a wide open space or a beach, you're not doing nearly as badly as much of the rest of the country. Those guys are down the least amount. Iowa overall is about 40%, right in line with a lot of, again, the pure Midwestern markets that you see. So one of the things that happened, and this was something that was truly unique in the industry that no one, I don't think, really expected to happen, was the pandemic essentially eliminated advanced bookings for a lot of cases. In the past, a very large chunk of bookings were happening, 50, 60, 90 days in the future. And during the height of the pandemic, last April and May, the average bookings were under 2 weeks in advance purchase. By the summer, we were finally getting out to 30 days and really kind of hovered in that 30-day mark up through January. Essentially what we saw with the change in having vaccinations, with things kind of getting a little bit better in places in the country, people started looking at, booking out a little bit further in the future, looking at summer vacations or spring break type vacations. And we started seeing that trend start ticking upward for the advanced bookings, how far in the future people were booking their flights. But one of the things that's not happened, though, essentially is corporate traffic still doesn't exist. So there's two kind of worlds of corporate travel. You have the, must travel. If, you got to go visit a client because something broke. You've got to deal with, machinery installation, things like that. That traffic really never changed through the pandemic. Frankly, in the height of the pandemic from April to, June of last year, emergency travel for friends and family visits, as well as that emergency business travel, was really the only things traveling. And that really hasn't changed for the business travel. There really isn't much in the way of the discretionary business traffic. Things like, sales calls, conferences, stuff like that hasn't existed. It hasn't come back yet. And that's what's worrying the airlines so much right now is while leisure is really picking up and getting back, in some cases, especially this summer, to normal levels in a lot of places in the country, that business market just doesn't show any signs of recovery yet. And that's something that the airlines, as well as us and airports, are really, really monitoring, because that right there is probably the single most important feature for markets like Dubuque, because we are a very business-centric market, historically speaking. Until that business traffic comes back, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge in some of these smaller markets to get back to where we were in 2019 or prior. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more detail about American Airlines United on these next couple of slides to talk about this. Again, obviously, American is our number one or our only carrier, and they initially cut capacity about 75%. Again, absolutely decimated international, and domestic was hit quite hard as well. And they really focused on rebuilding, Dallas and Charlotte first. Once essentially the fall of last year hit, Phoenix and Miami then really started coming into their own as well. And so when you look at, going forward, Dallas is down only 10% from 2019 levels. Charlotte's down only 4% from 2019 levels when you look at May. But Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. are down, 35, 50% still versus 2019, in large part because they're business-centric hubs. People go to Chicago not necessarily because they're going on vacation, they go there for work. Same thing with Philadelphia, same thing with Washington, D.C., and that's really changed for American. International service is essentially still gone for all intents and purposes outside of a handful of Asia and Europe flights. This summer, America's starting to put back a little bit more internationally as some of Europe has been opened back up to vaccine travel. But again, unless you're to South America, unless you're the Caribbean, there really isn't much international traffic there. Again, I mentioned about 150 aircraft removed from their fleet. They are actually getting delivered. So they're getting, new Boeing 737s. They're getting new Boeing 787s delivered, but just nowhere near as fast as they retired those aircraft. So it is going to take quite literally years to bring that capacity back in. You have new partnerships with Alaska and JetBlue. That is something they announced here over the last year. Alaska joined oneworld, so Seattle is now a major oneworld hub for them. JetBlue is doing a deal directly with American as far as a Northeast partnership, and that has led to a lot of new routes, going up into Seattle as well as into Boston and New York, as JetBlue and American are kind of trading off routes on what makes the most sense for each one to operate. So there is that kind of concentration there, but otherwise, essentially, America's been really concentrating on wide open spaces, Jackson Holes, Rapid Cities, Kalispell's, Bozeman's. That's really where they've been concentrating a lot of their growth for this summer. May 2021, about 23% fewer departures, 20% fewer fewer seats than May 2019. Again, really kind of leading the way for the legacy carriers in that regard. Yet to be seen if that's the right financial move on American's part, because they have had a much lower fare than Delta has. Even though they've got more seats and more passengers, it hasn't paid off in more profitability yet for them. United Airlines, again, they cut not quite as deep, a little bit more than American. In large part, if you look at United's route structure, they've got hubs in Newark, Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, L.A., Houston, and really the only, not greatly affected market was Denver for them. And so they really kind of, by, bad luck, based off of how the COVID had hit the airlines, their coastal hubs really, really got hammered, and they've stayed really hit hard, even in 2021 here. When you look at San Francisco, Los Angeles, Newark, really are lagging the entire industry for rebound. And that's something that has absolutely affected United, but it's also kind of hit kind of doubly hard. While Denver has been their saving grace, they've also accelerated their gate renewal and their redoing of the Denver hub this year while things were reduced. They are planning on opening about 30 new gates into Denver starting next year, which will essentially take them from about 60 gates up to 90 gates. But that means while Denver has got a massive amount of demand this summer, there's no room for growth for them. They've essentially kind of hit the proverbial brick wall with the amount of gates that they have there. There are some scope clause concerns that have impacted the regional side because of retirements and furloughs of their mainline pilots. That is something we'll kind of have to see how that plays out for growth in the regional world over the next couple of years with United. But when you look at May 2021, again, as I mentioned, America was down about 20%. United's down about 38% in departures, 42% in seats. That is driven almost 100% by Newark, Washington, Dulles, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Chicago's down a bit for them. Denver's actually flat for them, but those hubs really have been down really, really hard in the last over the last year and a half. The other ones, again, not quite as pertinent, but again, it's really affecting the industry. Delta, they've been really, again, as I mentioned, the most conservative of adding the capacity back. The middle seat blocking ends May 1st. That's something that they were really the last of the airlines by quite a bit to bring that back. Southwest was the previous one, and that was several months ago that they had that back in. And they've been really concentrating on Salt Lake City, which is essentially flat. And that's been, again, that wide open spaces. A lot of that capacity is going to Colorado's, Idaho's, Montana's, Wyoming's, and that has really helped that Salt Lake City hub. Southwest, what they ended up doing, while they parked a lot of airplanes, they decided to essentially try to bring those airplanes back by going after new revenue streams, new destinations. They added 17 new destinations around the country, things like Colorado Springs all the way down to, Steamboat Springs out in Colorado. So they went for, some ski markets. They went for wide open spaces with Bozeman. They've even added markets like Eugene, Oregon. So again, they've really kind of adjusted what they're going for and trying to tap into additional revenue streams. Allegiant was kind of the one that's growing kind of through this whole thing. They were down only a little bit in 2020, about 6%. They're actually growing in early 2021, and they're growing essentially throughout the rest of the year as well. They were fortunate for some respects because their leisure focus was focused on Florida and Arizona and markets like that really, really actually didn't get hit too hard in this process. Spirit's down a little bit in 2021 versus 2019, but again, they've really been able to weather this much, much better than everybody else, focusing on leisure markets and adding new cities. They've been able to get into a whole bunch of new markets through this year, trying to get new revenue streams, trying to chase passenger traffic, essentially. And interestingly, what's kind of ironic for the industry is, we've never had a worse period of time ever in the airline industry, but we have a whole slew of new airline entrants. Two kind of, have been the most public out there, Avilo and Breeze. Both of them are founded by very much veterans of the industry. Andrew Levy, who was one of the founders of Allegiant, he was the president of United Airlines, was also involved in a bunch of other startups over the years. That's Avilo, and they are starting up over the next month or so out in Burbank, but they're operating very large, 190-seat aircraft to some mid-sized Western U.S. markets initially. We expect growth beyond that, but again, with very large aircraft. Breeze is the one that's kind of, in some respects, a little bit more interesting for a market like Dubuque. They are planning on operating 100 to 140-seat aircraft. We're expecting them to start up this summer, as early as even June of this year. We're expecting, announcements probably within the next week or two with new routes. So there's just speculation on exactly what they're doing, but we're able to kind of surmise it's predominantly right now starting on the East Coast, surrounding initially leisure markets predominantly. But again, we really don't know exactly what they're going to be doing until we start seeing their announcements. Two regional airlines are kind of being rebirthed, for lack of a better term. Via Airlines went out of business a couple of years ago. They got bought up by a company called Wexford Capital that actually used to own Republic Airways in Chautauqua. And they are looking to start up service with 50-seat airplanes into unserved markets this summer. And ExpressJet used to be a major operator going back to the day of Continental and Delta and then United. They lost their contracts for over 150 airplanes with United through the pandemic, and they've essentially shrunk down to a handful of airplanes and are planning on starting back up with 50-seat aircraft initially, independent operations. Again, not sure exactly where those guys are going to be, mainly because they haven't even announced anything publicly, either via or ExpressJet. So again, as we look at it, and we'll talk about Dubuque here in a little bit, more specifics, but COVID-related collapse in demand is going to take years to recover from. Leisure in some markets are likely going to be up in 2021. So again, if you're located in Montana, Idaho, some of the secondary Florida markets, the likelihood is you're actually going to be up in 2021 versus 2019. In some cases, upwards of 50 or 100% bigger than 2019, as the airlines are just absolutely pounding capacity into those leisure markets. Business markets are going to take a while, and frankly, it's unknown. There's a speculation that the business market may never recover back to the level it was before. We just don't know, and that's really the billion-dollar question in the industry is what the corporate business traveler will do, because at the end of the day, markets like Dubuque and hundreds of others around the country live and die on corporate travel. The American, Delta, United, Southwest live and die on corporate travel, and that is going to be something that has to come back for the industry to recover. New entrants are going to really kind of test the will of the legacy carriers as they are struggling, as they're literally struggling for survival. You've got massively well-funded new entrants that are run by industry veterans coming in and trying to gobble up market share. And then fleet and financial restructuring has absolutely, changed this recovery. Again, there is no way to do a V recovery anymore. The aircraft physically aren't there for the next couple of years for many of the airlines. So when you look at, Dubuque overall, so, when we went back to 2012 through 2018, 2019, things really had, been improving. We had been able to absorb additional capacity as American switched out of 44-seaters to 50-seaters into the marketplace, and employments had been going up. Needless to say, 2020 was very hard, and then we had the suspension of service for almost 3 months at the end of the year. Really has impacted Dubuque very hard on passenger numbers. So when you look at TSA passenger throughput, again, we kind of talked about before on the kind of absolute numbers. This is looking at the percentages versus 2019 for passenger throughput. You can see the national is in that kind of that greenish color. Great Lakes is that gray. Blue is Iowa, and then red is Dubuque. And up until American announced the suspension of Dubuque service back in September of last year or end of August of last year, Dubuque had actually been at or above the TSA throughput from the region, from Iowa. That changed dramatically when American made that announcement, and then kind of delayed it with the CARES Act, and then they actually suspended service in October, and then brought it back in January. Except that really did have an impact on getting those passengers back in the market, and we've really kind of struggled in some respects lower than the regional numbers through that period of time. One of the other reasons for that is because Dubuque is a very business-oriented market. That's one of the selling points we always made to all the airlines when we would go talk to them, American, United, everybody else, is we're a business-oriented airport. We have a huge, Fortune 500 and local businesses component that traveled that just hasn't come back in the same numbers. And that's something that, because of that, until that opens back up, we are likely to lag the industry in the region on passenger numbers. When you look at capacity changes, kind of looking at some of our regional brethren, and here it is the airport codes. So CID is Cedar Rapids, Seaway is Central Wisconsin, Wausau, Dubuque, obviously our DBQ, Moline down the road, Madison up the road, Peoria, and then Sioux City is Sucks there. And so you can see, seats by market versus 2019. First off, right through 2020, it's before the pandemic hit. Most of the markets were actually up in seats versus it. We trailed, right in line, a little bit lower, but right in line with everybody else until September. And we've kind of, been below that because of the American decision to suspend service and then not suspend service and then actually suspend service. We have been below that. Good news is, May is getting a little bit better. Looking forward into the next month or so. And again, we don't know exactly what June, July, and August have in store for us, mainly because the airlines aren't putting their schedules out nearly as far in advance as they used to, just because they're trying to wait to see how the economy responds. So load factor trends, again, you can see here the various peer markets. Dubuque started off a little bit lower than everybody else, kind of tracked in line with everybody else through the pandemic. And obviously, once that announcement was made in August by American, we went from, right in the middle of the pack to below the pack. And that's not, frankly, a coincidence. As again, I mentioned before, that uncertainty of being able to book out of Dubuque and if it's going to be there, the flights, absolutely impacted the ability to retain the customers locally. And then, January, when you look at when we got the service back in, not real surprisingly, we're much lower than that. Not having service for several months absolutely impacts the ability to retain that traffic. But we are seeing, positive signs of recovery there, and we do see that as, climbing back up towards our peer markets as we move through 2021. So what's going on in the airlines in 2021? And this is something that, probably every few days you're seeing on the news, you're seeing in the newspaper, online, that new routes are being announced, new cities are being announced by the airlines. It's really kind of a misnomer, a catch-22 or tale of two worlds, as you were. The airlines aren't adding business routes. So you're not seeing any routes to Chicago, unless it's Chicago to Florida or Chicago to Hawaii or Chicago to the mountains. But you're not seeing, routes really to New York or Boston that's not leisure oriented. The airlines are adding leisure markets. So again, if you're Bozeman, if you're Rapid City, if it's Kalispell, Sarasota, Fort Myers, those markets have seen, 10, 15, 100% increases in the amount of flights going into this summer. Traditional business routes are still down 30, 40, 50% this summer. So those new markets really are not, or new routes are kind of misnomers, because again, the airlines aren't really adding necessarily traditional markets, and frankly, markets that probably aren't going to stick around more than a couple of years in a lot of cases. They're just trying to chase people, trying to chase passengers where people want to go. So one of the other things that's kind of happening is, through the Small Community Air Service Development Grant Program, through state funds, through local funds, as communities have lost air service, what's kind of happened is you've gotten a war chest almost phenomena that's occurred in a lot of markets for new service. So a lot of states have started throwing money at this. A lot of markets have been able to do SCASD. We're essentially now going to have 2 full cycles of these SCASD grants that are not been used, of which Dubuque falls right in the middle of that. So there's literally going to be dozens and dozens of cities around the country that are going to have very significant war chests to try to bring back and restore service in 2022 and beyond, which will create, frankly, even larger competition as the airlines are looking for that next best route, especially to markets like Denver, which United is going to grow dramatically next year. But it's going to be a big competition, frankly. You're going to be having not only, 70, 80, 100 different markets essentially looking at service to Denver. A very large chunk of those are going to have money just like what we have. So it is going to be a little bit more competitive. So when you look at, specifically, American did restore service in January 2021 through the extension of federal aid initially, and then this last stimulus bill that was done a month ago at this point, that extended it through September 30th of 2021. That at least limits the risk from our perspective at Dubuque of losing service again initially, and again from American during that period of time. We're hoping that things continue recovering, especially in the business communities through this summer into the fall, so that there is minimal risk of losing service. The problem is we just don't know what's going to happen, frankly, in the national and world economy with COVID, all of that as we move forward. So there is still risk there in the industry, but we hope it's much diminished from what it was last year. We've had some very positive discussions with various airlines regarding our Small Community Air Service Development Grant for Denver service. Kind of the overarching theme has really been markets like Dubuque are much more business oriented, and because of that, it's kind of a twofold whammy right now. One, Denver physically has no more gates for service this year, even though United would probably love to fly a couple hundred more flights a day at Denver in 2021. They just can't. Those gates come online next year. We're expecting, a couple hundred more flights from United over the next couple of years to be added to Denver, of which I think we are very well positioned to be part of that. But it is not something that is any chance really of happening this year because of the gating situation and because of the uncertainty with the business environment. So we're really focusing on trying to set ourselves up, get our message out, get all our ducks in a row, position ourselves as well as we can to get into that 2022 timeframe for service. And again, this last bullet point, air service has been a marathon. Essentially, this created this as an Ironman marathon with everything that has been going on with COVID, and really essentially reset a lot of things. We don't know what the business community is going to do recovery-wise, both nationally and frankly even in Dubuque as far as travel needs are concerned. Obviously, there will still be travel needs. Will it be the same? Will it be more? Will it be less? That's really what the airlines are trying to determine as we go into 2022 and beyond, is what that new business market is going to look like and how it affects smaller markets. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And this is Todd. And then a good point or a reminder, we did have a headquarters meeting, yourself, the chamber, the airport with United, and they did reinforce that you know, obviously nobody's looking at 2021. We're not looking to expand any service, but 2022, we're basically back on their books for a new meeting. If you could switch over to the slide 24, I know you're pretty quick with that, but while you're getting there, I do have to mention too, and in his intro, Jeff did used to work for American Airlines, and coincidentally, back when I was an interim airport manager a while back and working with the Chamber Air Service Task Force, Jeff is who we went to add a fourth flight on American into Dubuque. And thank you for that, Jeff, even though you're no longer with American. The point here is he's from that background. He knows what these people are looking for. They've got, as you can clearly tell from his presentation, you know, they're connected to some of the best data that's out there that not only the consultants are using, but also the air carrier. They're all using the same thing, and Jeff knows exactly what they're looking for, and he's been quite honestly invaluable to Dubuque as far as helping us watch and communicate with the air carriers. On this slide, I just want to point, I know it's in yellow, it's kind of hard to see, and not only Dubuque, but airport numbers have dropped across the nation, around the globe, quite honestly. But as you can see, January, I'm going to say we were at 324, February 486, and I'm happy to report in March, we were at 807. So that was a number I wasn't able to get to Jeff, but just so the audience's information, we took a fairly large jump there. Again, that's only with one aircraft. You know, that puts, and then I think in another slide or two, Jeff had load factors. So at where that puts Dubuque as far as load factors, one aircraft, last I saw was we're in the mid 50s, which isn't terrible. But it's not great either. I can tell you our surrounding airports, your Cedar Rapids, your Moline, your Madison, they're pushing the upper 60s, lower 70s, which is more kind of the national average right now. But we're also playing a little bit of the chicken and the egg game. We've only got up until April, we only had one flight a day, which limits the connections. Although the times were good. We had a flight that went out first thing in the morning so you could catch the outbound connections, and we had a flight that returned later in the evening so you could capture all the inbound flights to get back to Dubuque at a decent hour. In April, there was a flight added around 11, which we don't have the data for that yet. Of course, it just started in April. But again, with that one flight, you're playing chicken and the egg. You know, you want to fly up Dubuque, but maybe that didn't work with your connection time because it might be several hours later. But we do appreciate everybody taking into consideration the free parking, less congestion, you know, the easy touch-free experience that you have here at Dubuque. Once you go through Dubuque and you hit Chicago O'Hare, you're in the system. You don't have to go through the drive time, and you know, take into consideration your friends and neighbors and family that work here at the airport or are connected with the airport in some sort of way. So we do appreciate that. Yeah, and with that, I'll turn it over for questions. We both didn't know how long we were going to go, but it looks like we've got about 10 minutes. Justine, anything or?
Well, I want to start with just to Todd's point. If you guys are ever curious, on the Chamber's website, and I'm going to put this in the chat for anybody to see, we have a true cost calculator that compares the prices from Dubuque to some surrounding airports. And to that point of having free parking at the Dubuque airport, what is your time worth as far as the commute? So you can kind of calculate that and see some information. So I just put that in the chat for anybody who wants to see and test that out. Otherwise, visit the Chamber website. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat now. This presentation will be made available on the Chamber website by tomorrow morning. So if you want to watch it again or have some questions, you can reach out to the Chamber and we can get those to Jeff and Todd to answer. or please share this with people and other companies and in your company for some of this really valuable information. I think to start with, the question we have is, why can't Dubuque get a new company like Breeze or other discount carriers?
Well, I think the key, I wouldn't say you can't. I think the part of the issue is we're not exactly 100% certain where some of these new entrant carriers are going. The Breeze was announced, over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago. Needless to say, the pandemic slowed down their process quite a bit. We are expecting, it could be the next day or two, it could be in the next week or two, that they will be announcing their initial, 6, 7 cities. They are growing essentially, an aircraft a month for the next, frankly, 5 to 10 years. And so I think, long term meaning, next year and a half, we'll have a better feel for where they're going to end up going. A lot of the low hanging fruit for them, especially in some of these bigger markets, that they're trying to get market share in while the airlines are as impacted with COVID as they are. Absolutely, I think a market like Dubuque would fall into a plan like a Breeze. When you look at a Velo or some of these other ones, or even frankly, traditional ones of Sun Country or an Allegiant, partly it's because of what's around. Allegiant serves virtually all of our surrounding markets, and because of that, they don't see a big upside in new revenue since they're kind of already surrounding us everywhere. At Moline and at Cedar Rapids and stuff like that. And frankly, they're bigger aircraft. I mean, the bigger the aircraft, like on a Velo, it's going to be harder it is to fill up that service on a consistent basis from Dubuque. And so that is a challenge. That's something that we're working on. And that's frankly why I think Breeze is such a unique opportunity, because of the smaller aircraft.
I'll piggyback on that a little bit, because that's probably one of the biggest questions I get is, well, why don't we just get Delta in here, or how about Southwest, or something like that. And some of these, the way I explain it is a population base, because people recognize what's the population of Dubuque compared to like what's the population of Des Moines, and in the aviation world, it's called a catchment area. So unless you have a catchment area of over Jeff, 500,000, or over 500,000, the Deltas in the Southwest, they won't even look at and trust me, they're looking at the same data that Jeff had pulled up for this presentation across the nation. So the way I explain it is it's kind of a population base. So Dubuque is this population. We have this much catchment area within a certain mile radius. And then, of course, Des Moines, that has multiple air carriers and multiple discount carriers, they have a much larger population and a much larger catchment area. And then you can even look at Chicago if you wanted to go to the next step. So you could also work in reverse. You could go to an airport like Fort Dodge Airport, for example, in Iowa. Much smaller population, smaller catchment area. In the past, they've had turboprop aircraft that had 10 seats. And they are also backed, it's called the Essential Air Service, which is funded by the federal government. So you've got an airport like Fort Dodge, their population, their air service. Dubuque population, our air service. And then you can go to Cedar Rapids, Des Moines, for example, even Chicago. So that's kind of the quick and easy way to explain it. It's obviously it's much more in depth. There are some, some caveats out there. For example, if you are a population our size, but you have a military facility nearby that they fly a lot, or a large college like Iowa or Iowa State. I know we have 3 colleges here, which is fantastic, and they do use Dubuque, but a huge campus like Iowa or something like that, that's what also incorporates into the Cedar Rapids market. So I know we're running close on time, and I don't want to keep talking. I'm like Jeff. We could just talk airport aviation all day long.
You guys are in the right business.
We want to, but we definitely want to answer the questions best we can, and remind everybody they can go back. There is a lot of information here. There's a lot of data. Trying to get everything out that we can. Feel free to go back, get this off the chamber website, use the pieces that you need. I know working with Keith with Travel Dubuque, one of our partners, he finds this information very helpful because he's watching the aviation bell curves and how it's how it's progressing. So and I'd like to, all of our partners, really, the city, the county, GDC, and of course the chamber. We appreciate all their support.
Thank you. Todd, could you repeat the Dubuque passenger numbers for January, February, and March, please?
Yes. Well, I have, January there was 324. Then we took a jump in February to 486. And then in March up to 807. So we're seeing a steady increase there. But then again, remember, that was only with one flight a day, which pre-COVID, our numbers that you see on the screen were 3 flights a day.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
I don't see any other questions at this time. So Jeff and Todd, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make before we sign off, the mic is yours.
Jeff, go ahead. I'll let you start.
Yeah, no, again, I just appreciate you guys and the chamber and Todd setting this up. Obviously, the airline industry is changing quite dramatically on a literal daily basis at this point. And I'm happy to be able to work with the Dubuque area and the Dubuque Regional Airport to help wade our way through this. And while it's been a challenge, obviously we see things improving quite a bit in March and April and going forward, and that we're hopeful that getting into this fall, going into next year, we'll finally get back to a little bit more of a normalcy in the industry and be able to hopefully again utilize what the community's been able to step up with and the matching support with the SCASD to recruit in United Airlines and hopefully be able to have 2 carriers and strong service at the airport. But again, it's definitely it takes a village right now and takes a lot of time in understanding that this is a very unique, unprecedented period in the industry that nobody ever expected to see, and God knows I hope I never see again.
Yeah, and I'll echo that too. And Jeff's right. It does take a village, and in our case, every passenger counts. So if you want to see air service retained, if you want to see air service increase, you have to fly Dubuque. The airport and the consultants, we can only do so much. It's the passengers that are buying those tickets that tell the true story. And if you choose to fly out of another airport, then you're just giving them one more passenger that Dubuque won't be able to use for that statistic to take to that air carrier to make that point. So that being said, I thank you, Jeff, again for putting this together, being on. Thank you, the Chamber Board, President Molly, Justine, thank you for putting all this together in your time. And fly Dubuque, everyone.
Thank you.
Fly Dubuque, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.